Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 3 of our Out the Whiteboard series. This week we continue our discussion from last week, discussing nutrition and lifestyle factors still. We're still in phase 2 of our progression from phase 1, 2, and 3 of our nutrition and lifestyle prescription. Just to rehash that one more time, phase 1 are kind of the fundamentals of where we would like to see you start with this stuff. Getting proper protein intake, proper hydration, emphasizing the quality of the foods that you're eating, and also starting to track your response to foods. So how much you're eating, what you're eating, and how you're responding to that within maybe an hour or a couple hours of eating that food, just to start to take on an awareness of how you react to the foods that you're eating and whether they're providing you with energy or taking energy away from you in some way, shape, or form. Once you have those items in place, the idea is then we are prepared and we've sort of like earned the opportunity to move on to our phase 2 items. We talked about our carb and fat prescription and how that kind of plays into the total amount of macronutrients that we would consume on a daily basis and what the best sources of those things are. This week we're going to continue our discussion in phase 2 surrounding food sensitivities, and then also some lifestyle factors. It's not going to be a fully comprehensive discussion around that. That's a topic that could take on 10 videos in and of itself. But just some basic stuff that we can start to think about. So that's where we'll start the discussion, is around food sensitivities and some things that we should really consider potentially eliminating from our diet simply because we're not having positive reactions to those foods. So this kind of stems back to phase 1 in terms of tracking our response to food. So the idea now is start to develop an awareness of when we have a negative, acute reaction to the foods that we eat. And there are some popular culprits of this that we'll discuss in a second. But some of the things that we'll talk about with response or in regards to food sensitivities and the reactions that we can have to foods are going to be in the form of what we listed here. One is like kind of gastrointestinal distress as a response to food, gas or bloating specifically. I think a lot of people just think that this is a normal reaction to food, that, you know, I eat food and sure, I'm just going to start burping and farting and my stomach's going to be distended, and that's just kind of par for the course. That's not a normal response to food. So if that's happening to you on a consistent basis, on a chronic basis, we have to sort of dig a little bit further and understand exactly what foods potentially are causing that. That might be a function also of food hygiene, which we'll get to in a second. Second is itchiness. So you actually have a reaction to food where it makes you start to scratch a little bit. Joint pain. So I know for me personally, if I consume wheat, so specifically gluten, the next day, if I overconsume it especially, the next day typically my joints feel quite stiff and it's hard for me to move as freely and readily as I normally would. So just something to be aware of, that's a potential response that you could have. Headaches, or just like a fuzziness of your brain as a response to food. This is a pretty common thing that we see. Runny or stuffed noses, as well as a scratchy throat. So any of those things that, while we might just write them off as being just the normal response to life and stress and just how we function, and we kind of just assume that that's normal, those are not normal things that are happening on a regular basis. And oftentimes, certainly there's other factors that will play a role in that, but oftentimes they're taking place as an acute reaction to some type of food sensitivity that we have that we may not even be aware of. So some of the most popular culprits here are going to be these guys: dairy. So anything derived from milks or cow's milk. So yogurt and cheese and actual milk itself and ice cream and things like that. That would be considered dairy. Grains. And just to go back to dairy, so I had an actual blood test done and it came back that I was allergic to cow's milk. So for me, dairy, and I knew that intuitively just based upon some of the reactions, specifically that boy right there, that I was getting from consuming dairy. And that still to this day is the case. And so, that's something that I have to avoid, not just because of this, but also more deeper, kind of more serious underlying consequences of consuming it, because I actually have an allergy to cow's milk. So grains, so specifically the grains that contain gluten. I mean, the grains that don't have gluten, sometimes you can have these reactions as well. but specifically be on the lookout for gluten-containing grains, so wheat, soy can create these reactions in a lot of people, and as well as eggs. And sometimes it isn't necessarily a food allergy that you have. It could be a result of just consuming too much of a certain food group, and over time that can start to lead to some issues. Your body starts having difficulty absorbing the food and responding to the food in a positive way, and it starts releasing some antibodies that create some bad reactions in your body. So some of the more popular things, not the only things that can be on that list. I found out I was allergic to bananas through the blood test that I had done, which was kind of weird because when I eat bananas, I don't have any of this stuff take place. Certainly maybe if I consumed like 10 bananas, I might start to feel some effects of it, but just be on the lookout for that. That there's potentially other items of food that can fall into this list. And that's all comes back to tracking your response and having an awareness of any potential acute reactions to the foods you eat. The best strategy for potentially figuring them out, in addition to just tracking your response, is if you identify a food that you think potentially is creating some of these reactions, is to eliminate it for a minimum of about 2 to 3 weeks. You could argue maybe a little bit longer, but that's a good amount of time. If you completely eliminate it 100%, and then reintroduce it on one day in a pretty aggressive manner. So have more perhaps than what you would normally even consume. Maybe eat that food 2 or 3 times on that given day, just to make sure that the response is fairly acute and you have a good awareness of whether that food is creating that type of response in your body when you eat it. So that's a great strategy. You can do it one at a time. So in other words, don't eliminate all of them and try to reintroduce all of them at once, because then you'll have no idea which is the actual culprit of this. So the example would be just to eliminate dairy for 2 to 3 weeks. If you're currently eating all this stuff and getting some kind of reactions, just eliminate 1, 2 to 3 weeks, then reintroduce it, see what happens. If you don't have a negative reaction to it when you reintroduce it, move on to the next one and see what happens there. That's probably the best strategy for figuring out how to eliminate the foods that are creating these reactions. If it's more of an underlying thing, what we would consider to be a food intolerance. So like in my case, for example, with the dairy, it went beyond just acute reactions and sensitivities, but an actual allergy to that food. That would have to be done through actual tests. There's a couple different types of tests you can get done. You can research that, speak to your doctor. I'm happy to consult with you on that if you have questions about it. But to see if you have an actual allergy to a food, if it potentially is creating an autoimmune response in your body, that's what you would have to get done. That kind of outside the scope of this discussion as far as the parameters behind that and what's involved. But certainly if you think that it's causing some deeper underlying issues, specifically some autoimmune issues that people suffer from, then the food intolerance tests would be the way to go. Alright, so that's a great way to kind of, again, emphasize the quality of the food that we're eating, kind of coming back around to that phase 1 piece, just the fundamental foundational stuff that we talked about, and being a little bit more specific about eliminating certain foods that you have a poor response to. Moving on now to the lifestyle factors. Again, this is a conversation that could extend really, really long and really diverse in terms of all the things that we have to consider around managing stress in our lives and managing, the potential anxieties that we face and all how that affects us on a level of health. But we're going to just cover some real basic stuff that you have full control over. We can't eliminate stress from our lives. It's just not realistic. We can certainly manage it in certain ways. But let's focus on the pieces that we can take control over. First is sleep. Sleep is arguably really a phase 1 topic of discussion. But just because sleep can be a really tricky thing to develop a new routine around, we reserve it for phase 2. But sleep certainly is up there with food quality in terms of importance. Maybe even more important, arguably, for some reasons. The parameters surrounding sleep are to get at least 7 to 9 hours per night. That's for adults. Children would need more sleep. Older adults, and let's call them senior citizens, can require a little bit less sleep. But 7 to 9 is a good guideline to try to follow. A couple sleeping habits that are important. One is that you try to go to bed and wake up at the same time every single night. So you develop this really consistent routine around sleep, and that includes weekdays as well as weekends, and that's where a lot of people run into trouble, is their routine gets disrupted Friday night and Saturday night, and then Sunday night when they're trying to get to bed at a normal time so they can wake up early on Monday, they find themselves in sort of out of rhythm and having trouble falling asleep at that early hour. That's not a great routine to stay in. Those 2 days of disrupted routine can really kind of throw things off for the rest of the week and have a really negative impact on us. So trying to keep that routine consistent is really important. This 7 to 9 hours per night, I mean, there are some guidelines and things that you should consider as far as making sure the sleep is really high quality sleep and it's uninterrupted. I'm sure, there's not anything revolutionary that I'm going to say as far as making sure the room is dark, the TV is off, you have a good routine around getting to bed and winding down, and not doing anything too stimulating leading up to going to sleep, so on and so forth. And there's tons of research and articles and anecdotal stuff that you can read surrounding that, so I'm not going to get too into that topic. But if you're having trouble getting a consistent solid 7 to 9 hours uninterrupted at night, certainly there's opportunities for perhaps changing some things to make sure that can be a consistent routine. So really, really important. Those are stars. So consistent with that now, sorry, before we move on, so with the sleep now, the question is sometimes, we have like a 9 o'clock class, for example, and for some people that's the only time they can come in and get the workout in. This is 9 o'clock at night, and it's kind of like, well, hopefully you have an opportunity to complete a workout that late, get to bed, still get to bed at a reasonable hour, and make sure that you're still getting enough sleep consistent with that 7 to 9 hour range. And the question is, if it comes down to exercising or sleep, the answer is sleep. Honoring sleep first and foremost is critically important. If we are in a state of sleep deprivation on a chronic basis, basically the pattern that starts to be created in our body is consistent with what happens with type 2 diabetes. So things along the lines of insulin resistance and difficulty utilizing fatty acids properly to utilize as energy, and fat distribution starts to take place and things of that nature. So sleeping, honoring sleep first and making sure that we're moving towards this range is more important than exercise, and that it pains me to say that. Second, because I love exercise, but I love sleep as well, even more. So second now is consistent with what we talked about as far as developing a nice consistent routine. So our weekday and our weekend routine, and that's surrounding two areas specifically. One is sleep, and I talked about that already. Making sure that we are still trying to get to bed and wake up at the same hour, still get an adequate amount of sleep. Sometimes naps on the weekend could be lifesavers if you can make that happen. If you're not getting enough sleep at night on the weekends and you get an afternoon nap in, that can certainly help make up for that. Second is the food and drink. So I think a lot of people have a routine where it's like, during the week I'm good to go, I'm sticking with everything, and then on the weekend I just kind of loosen the reins and go crazy. Certainly there's nothing wrong with loosening the reins and maybe having a little something that you normally wouldn't eat, having a couple drinks, so on and so forth. But if it's like crazy time on the weekends for 48 hours, perhaps even 72 hours, like Friday happy hour to late Sunday night, that's going to create a problem. I mean, that's a big chunk out of the week where you're just kind of loosening the reins a little too much, and to recover from that adequately and then fall back into a normal routine is just not practical or realistic. So certainly, loosen the reins a little bit, have a beer, have a glass of wine, have some ice cream, whatever the case may be, but make sure that you're not straying too far from what we would consider to be good practices for those 2 or 3 days potentially, because that will be obviously majorly disruptive to everything. So being consistent during the week as well as the weekend. Third is the topic of caffeine or energy drinks, in whatever manner or form that they come in. And then also the potential dependency on sleeping aids, whether it's sleeping pills or something else. And just as a broad brush kind of summary of that topic in general, is that if you're dependent upon these guys for energy during the day, and you're depending upon this to kind of calm down and go to sleep at night, that's a really dangerous routine to be in and be stuck in. It's a pretty vicious cycle that is very hard to get yourself out of. And typically that's a result of problems here, issues potentially back here with our phase 1 stuff in terms of food quality and proper hydration, and so on and so forth. So just look back to some other lifestyle factors and other nutritional practices that are potentially causing dips in energy that make you dependent upon caffeine or energy drinks, and also kind of what your routine looks like during the day leading up to the nighttime to make sure that you have the ability to calm down naturally and fall asleep without the assistance of any kind of sleeping aid. So yeah, if you find yourself like, I wake up, I can't function without my caffeine, and I love coffee more than anybody, but to rely upon it is not a normal or healthy lifestyle practice. And if you find yourself dependent upon sleeping aids, then something else has to be tweaked with your nutrition and lifestyle practices. As simple as that. For food hygiene, so the idea about food hygiene is basically that there are certain practices that should be in place when you do consume food that'll help with the digestive process, help with the absorption process, and really just allow for what you're actually putting in to be assimilated properly into your body and utilized. And so the first one is sit down and eat. So you're not driving in your car and kind of like shoving food in your mouth. You're not working and standing and kind of running around and shoving food in your mouth. The good practice is sit down at a table and take 5, 10, 15, or 20 minutes to actually eat a meal, preferably with other people in some sort of social situation. That also helps with the assimilation and digestion of food. 2 is to actually chew your food as well as you possibly can. I mean, the idea is to really start the digestive process as early as possible. So the more work we do up here, the less work we have to do down here. And if we're doing work down here, our stomach and the energy required to digest food is just taxing and exhausting on our system. And so the more work we do with our mouth, the easier it makes that process for our stomach. So chew your food really, really well. It's a good habit, good practice. Putting down your fork between each bite. So you take a bite of your food, you put your fork down, you chew it really well, you sort of like chill out for a second, take a breath, and then reconvene. You'll see people kind of inhaling food. It's usually not a good practice. And 4th is that we don't consume liquid before, with, or immediately after our meal. So we try to have at least a 20-minute window in front of our meal, no liquid during our meal, and then a 20-minute window after the meal. Just because liquid, especially colder liquid, is going to disrupt the digestive process. Our stomach has acid in it, and that is what allows for the food to be digested properly. And the liquid will have sort of a cooling effect on that acid and disrupt that entire process. So if you're accustomed to kind of sipping away at something with a meal, I'd say try to move that liquid either 20 minutes before, 20 minutes after, and see if there's a positive response from that. All right, gang. So that's it for this week. That concludes our phase 2 prescription. If you have any questions regarding any of that stuff, by all means, again, reach out to me through email or when you see me at the gym. I'm happy to discuss this stuff in greater detail. If you have specific questions about any of this stuff or where to get the food intolerance test done, just let me know. The next video will be surrounding our phase 3 prescription. If you still have yet to get this stuff in place, again, that's the place to start as always. And I don't know why I'm shouting. I'm starting to yell at the camera now. I'm so excited to be done here. So that's phase 1, phase 2. Hopefully you can go back and take a look at this stuff. If you have any questions regarding it, let me know. And then we'll move on to our phase 3 prescription next week. And thank you guys. All right.